Welcome back to Chess Tactic Today. In the Champions Chess Tour Finals 2024, two giants of modern chess collide, Magnus Carlsen with white and Ian Nepomniachtchi with black. The game explodes out of a queen's gambit, with early pawn breaks, sharp piece play, and a queen trade that leaves both sides wrestling in a complex middle game. Rooks invade, pawns race forward, and every endgame nuance becomes critical. This is a heavyweight duel packed with tension from start to finish. Let's jump right in. And we're off. Magnus Carlsen, with the white pieces, opens with pawn to d4, a classic solid choice, aiming for central control right from the get-go. Nepomniachtchi responds with knight to f6. This is one of the most popular and flexible replies, keeping his options open and preparing to challenge white's central dominance. Pawn to c4. This is the queen's gambit, immediately putting pressure on black's d5 square if he chooses to occupy it. White is building a powerful pawn center, and Nepo plays pawn to e6, preparing to develop his light-squared bishop and fortifying his central control. This often leads to a Nimzo Indian, or a queen's gambit declined. Knight to f3 from Magnus, a very safe and solid developing move, preparing to castle and preventing any annoying b4 pins. There it is, pawn to d5. Nepo solidifies his center, entering the main lines of the queen's gambit declined. This is a fortress-like setup, very tough to crack. Magnus develops his other knight to c3, adding more pressure to the center. All the standard opening principles are on display here. Control the center, develop your pieces. But look at this. Pawn to c5 from Nepo. This is the Tarrasch Defense, a much more ambitious and aggressive way to play. He's challenging white's center immediately, even at the cost of getting an isolated queen's pawn. Magnus accepts the challenge. Pawn takes on d5. This opens up the position and clarifies the central tension. The game's character is now being defined. An interesting recapture. Instead of the typical knight takes d5, Nepo plays pawn takes d4. This is a sharp line that pulls the white queen into the game early. Queen takes d4. Magnus's queen is now active, but it can also become a target. This is the trade-off. The board is wide open. And now pawn takes d5. After that sequence of trades, black is left with the classic IQP, an isolated queen's pawn. This can be a strength or a weakness, and the whole game will revolve around it. Magnus develops his bishop to g5, putting an immediate pin on the f6 knight. This is a standard move in these structures, increasing the pressure on black's central setup. Bishop to e7. A solid reply from Nepo, breaking the pin and preparing to get his king to safety by castling. Pawn to e3. A quiet but essential move. Magnus prepares to develop his own dark-squared bishop and connects his pawns. Nepo castles kingside without delay. Getting the king safe is always a top priority, especially in an open position like this one. Bishop to e2 from Magnus. He's mirroring black's development and is now ready to castle himself. Pawn to h6. Nepo asks the question of the g5 bishop. Does it retreat, or does it trade itself for the knight? This forces Magnus to make a decision. Magnus decides to trade. Bishop takes the knight on f6. This gives up the bishop pair, but it also saddles black with doubled f-pawns, although they do help control the center. Bishop takes f6. Nepo recaptures, opening up the long diagonal for his bishop. The structure is now set for the long haul. Queen to d2. Magnus repositions his queen to a safer square, connecting his rooks and keeping an eye on black's central pawn. Bishop to e6 from Nepo. A great developing move. It protects the d5 pawn and prepares to challenge white's control of the d-file. Magnus castles kingside. Both kings are now safe, and the real middle game battle is about to begin. The opening phase is officially over. An unusual move. Queen to d7. Nepo is likely looking to challenge for the d-file and maybe even trade queens to relieve some pressure. Rook to d1. Magnus immediately places his rook on the open d-file, directly opposing black's queen. A classic strategic idea you can use in your own games. And Nepo does the same, rook to d8. The fight for the d-file is on. Both sides are marshalling their heavy pieces. Knight to d4. A fantastic centralizing move. Magnus places his knight on a powerful outpost, where it controls key squares and pressures black's position. Knight to c6. Nepo develops his last minor piece and immediately challenges white's knight on d4. He wants to trade off this troublesome piece, and Magnus obliges. Knight takes bishop on e6. He's trading off his strong knight, but in return he damages black's pawn structure. Pawn takes e6. Now the isolated d-pawn is gone, but look at black's pawns. They are a bit weak. This is a subtle shift in the game. The position is still equal, but Magnus has created a long-term target. Knight to e4, a very clever repositioning. Magnus targets the weak pawn on d6 after a potential trade and aims to disrupt black's coordination. This is prophylactic play at its finest. Queen to e7. A good response, defending against threats and keeping the position solid. Knight takes bishop on f6 with check. Another trade. Magnus is simplifying the position, confident that he can outplay his opponent in the resulting structure. Queen takes f6. Nepo recaptures, and his queen is now very active. The position is heading towards an endgame, and it looks incredibly balanced. Rook to c1. Magnus brings his last piece into the game, controlling the c-file and preparing for future action. Nepo mirrors him, rook to c8. The battle for the open files is symmetrical. It's very hard to see how either side can make progress here. Pawn to h3. A useful little move. Magnus creates some breathing room for his king, preventing any back-rank checkmate issues later on. And pawn to a6 from Nepo. He's doing the same on his side, controlling the b5 square and preparing for the long grind. Pawn to b4. Here's the first real attempt to break the symmetry. Magnus starts expanding on the queen side, trying to create a weakness in black's camp. This is where the story of the game begins to take a turn. Knight to e5. Nepo finds a great central square for his knight. From here, it puts pressure on white's position and can't be easily dislodged. Queen to d4. Magnus offers a queen trade. He believes that the resulting endgame, though level, offers him better practical chances. Knight to d7. Nepo declines the trade for now, rerouting his knight. He's keeping the tension high. Bishop to g4! A very annoying move. Magnus attacks the e6 pawn and forces Nepo to respond. A little bit of tactical pressure. Knight back to e5. Nepo says, "I'm not falling for any tricks," and repeats the position. He's happy with his knight on this square. Bishop back to e2. Magnus calmly retreats. This dance between the pieces is all about probing for weaknesses without overcommitting. And knight back to d7. We have a repetition of moves. Are the players content with a draw? It seems like they are testing each other's nerves. Queen to d2. Magnus changes his move, avoiding the draw. He still believes there's something in this position. Nepo's knight returns to its favorite square, e5. It's a rock in the center of the board. The strategic battle continues. Pawn to b5. There's that queenside pressure again. Magnus forces the issue, opening the a-file and creating new dynamics. This is a key decision. Pawn takes b5. Nepo has to capture, otherwise his a-pawn would become a long-term weakness. Bishop takes b5. Now white's bishop is active on the queen side, but black's rook gets the open a-file in return. Knight to c4, a fantastic move from Nepo. He attacks the queen and the bishop, forcing another series of trades. He's playing very actively. Bishop takes knight on c4. Magnus has to make this trade. Pawn takes c4. This creates a passed pawn for black. It looks dangerous, but it's also a target. The game is getting sharper. But Magnus immediately gobbles it up. Rook takes the pawn on c4. That passed pawn didn't last long, did it? Rook to a8. An incredible tactical oversight from Nepo, or is it? No, wait. This isn't a blunder. What's the idea? Ah, there it is. Rook to a4. Magnus finds a brilliant defensive resource, pinning the rook. But hold on. The fireworks are about to start. Rook takes rook. Nepo sacrifices the exchange. This looks absolutely wild. He's giving up a rook for a bishop to activate his pieces. And now the queens come off. Queen takes queen, check. After all that tactical chaos, we are heading into a pure endgame. This is the moment the entire game pivots. King takes queen. Correction, it's qxd8 from Magnus, and Ian plays qxd8. My apologies, folks. Let's reset. Black's queen takes the queen on d8. Rook takes the queen on d8. Check. Magnus forces the final piece off the board to clarify the situation. We now enter a rook and pawn endgame. King to f7. Nepo brings his king into the game. In the endgame, the king is a fighting piece. This position looks completely drawn, but with Magnus Carlsen, you never know. Rook to d7. Check. Magnus immediately puts his rook on an active square, harassing the black king and preparing to attack pawns. King to f6. A good, active square for the king. It defends the pawns and prepares to support its own pieces. Rook takes the pawn on b7. Magnus wins a pawn, but in return. Nepo's rook on a2 becomes a monster. It's now behind white's pawns, ready to create chaos. This is classic rook endgame activity. Rook to b5. Magnus tries to control the advance of black's pawns, but it's a tough task. Pawn to g5. Nepo creates space for his king and prepares to challenge white on the king side. He's not just sitting back and defending. And Magnus responds with g4. This is a double-edged move. It stops black's expansion but creates a weakness around his own king. A very human, practical decision. Rook to a1, check. Nepo keeps the pressure on, forcing the white king to move. King to g2. The king finds a temporary safe haven. Rook to a2. Nepo's rook is like a phantom, appearing everywhere and tying down white's forces. Here's a key moment. Pawn to h4. Magnus voluntarily weakens his own pawn structure. Would you have played this? It looks risky, but his idea is to open the h-file for his own rook to create counterplay. This is high-level strategic thinking. Pawn takes h4. Nepo accepts the challenge. Now the h-file is open for business. And there it is. Rook to h5. Suddenly, Magnus's rook is incredibly active, targeting the weak h6 pawn. He's created winning chances out of thin air. King to g6. Nepo defends his pawn, but now his king is a bit exposed. Rook takes the pawn on h4. Magnus cashes in. The pawn count is equal again, but white's pieces are more active, and black's king is in a slightly awkward position. Rook to a4, tying the white king to the defense of the f4 pawn. A good defensive idea from Nepo. King to g3. Magnus improves his king's position, preparing to untangle his pieces. Rook to b4. Nepo shifts his rook, looking for new targets. Rook back to h5. Magnus keeps the pressure on the king's side. Every move is a patient step towards improving his position. And rook back to a4. The dance continues. Both players are looking for the slightest mistake from their opponent. Rook to b5. A subtle shift. Magnus is preparing to bring his king further up the board. King to f6. Nepo activates his king as well. The king is the most important piece in this phase of the game. Pawn to f4. Magnus creates a passed pawn. This is a huge step forward. He's sacrificing the safety of his king to create a long-term winning threat. Rook to a6. Nepo is trying to create counterplay against white's queenside pawns. King to f3. Look at that! The white king is marching up the board, becoming a powerful attacking piece. Rook to c6. The black rook is forced into a more passive, defensive role. Rook to h5. Again, Magnus targets the h-pawn, restricting black's options. King to g6. Forced to defend. King to e4. The march of the king continues. It's now in the center of the board, dominating the position. Rook to c3. Nepo tries to cut off the king's path, but it might be too late. Rook to f5. A clever move, preparing to support the advance of the f-pawn from the side. King to f6. Nepo's king is trying to create a blockade. Rook to a6. Magnus is patiently improving his position move by move. Rook to c4, check. A nuisance check, but it doesn't change the evaluation. King to f3. The king sidesteps easily. King to f7. Nepo's just trying to hold on. And there it is, pawn to f5. This is the breakthrough. This move shatters Black's defensive setup. Magnus creates a passed pawn, and now the path to victory is becoming clear. A truly decisive moment in this long struggle. A desperate attempt. Pawn to h5. Nepo tries to create his own passed pawn as a last-ditch effort for counterplay. Pawn takes e6, check. Magnus ignores the threat and continues with his own plan. His passed e-pawn is much faster and more dangerous. King to e7. The only move. Pawn takes h5. Now Magnus calmly deals with Black's threat. He has two connected passed pawns, which are usually decisive. Rook to h4. Nepo's rook is tied down to stopping the h-pawn. Rook to a5. Magnus's rook controls the board from the side, a technique known as the Lucena position principle. King takes the pawn on e6. Nepo wins one of the passed pawns, but at what cost? His king is now far away from the action. Pawn to e4. The other passed pawn begins its march. The white king will now shepherd it home. Rook to h3, check. A spite check. King to g4. The king moves forward, supporting the pawn. Rook to e3. Nepo tries to blockade the pawn with his rook. King to f4. But the king is just too strong. It defends the pawn and attacks the rook simultaneously. Rook to h3. The rook is forced back. Rook to a6, check. Magnus now uses his rook to drive the black king even further away. King to e7. The king is pushed to the side. Pawn to h6. The other passed pawn advances, creating a second, deadly threat. King to f7. The king is completely cut off. Pawn to e5. The e-pawn continues its unstoppable march. Rook to h5. Nepo is running out of moves. He's just shuffling his rook back and forth. Pawn to h7. What a monster. This pawn is the hero of the game. It completely paralyzes Black's rook and king, allowing the e-pawn to promote. A beautiful illustration of creating a decisive decoy. King to g7. Black's king is trapped in a cage of its own making. Rook to a7, check. Another check to push the king where Magnus wants it. King to g6. Forced. Pawn to e6. Just 2 squares away from becoming a queen. King to f6. Nepo's king tries to get back in the game, but it's a race against time he cannot win. Pawn to e7. 1 square away. The end is near. Rook to h4, check. A final, desperate check. King to f3. The king coolly steps aside. Rook takes the h-pawn. Nepo finally eliminates the decoy, but it's too late. And there it is, pawn to e8, promoting to a brand new queen. The culmination of dozens of moves of patient, precise play. From a dead-drawn position, Magnus has woven a masterpiece. Rook takes the rook on a 7. Nepo captures the rook, but now it's a queen versus rook endgame, which is a straightforward win for the queen. Queen to c6, check. The final phase begins. Magnus will now use his queen and king to weave a mating net. King to g7, king to g4. The white king joins the attack. Rook to e7. Nepo tries to build a fortress, but it won't be enough. King to f5. The king continues to advance. King to f8. Running to the corner. Queen to d6. A precise move, cutting off the king's escape routes. King to e8. Queen to c6. Check. King to f8. Queen to c4. Magnus is carefully closing the net, step by step. King to g7. Queen to b3. Rook to f7. Check. King to e6. A perfect square for the king, dominating the position. Rook to f6. Check. King to e7. Rook to g6. Queen to c3. Check. King to g8. Queen to e5. The final moves are being played. The mating net is almost complete. Rook to h6. Queen to g5. Check. This check forces the king to the h-file, where mate is imminent. King to h7. The king is trapped. King to f7. A beautiful final move. It forces the win, and at this point, Ian Nepomniachtchi resigns the game. There is nothing left to be done, and that's the game. A truly stunning display of endgame technique from Magnus Carlsen, turning an equal position into a work of art. It's a powerful reminder that in chess, the game is never over until it's truly over. Thanks for watching us here on Chess Tactic Today.